is Monday, April 17th, and welcome to Your Voice, Your Future. I'm your moderator, Armstrong Williams. Presidential candidate Steve Laffey is back with us today. Charles Faddis is also back with us today, and joining us later, John Keyes. There's this talk when you listen to the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, the Kenyans, they all are getting together to replace the almighty dollar. I will tell you, Steve and Charles, I've had more calls from people asking me about whether the dollar and their money is safe from every socioeconomic background. What do you say, Steve, to address those concerns of the seriousness of this possibility?
Well, it is a very serious possibility. A back check to 1971, where U.S. dollars were 80 to 90% of all the transactions, they fell to the 50th percentile, made it back up. The euro came along, and about 57% of all international transactions are done in dollars, 20% with the euro. So the U.S. dollar will remain the world's currency for some time, but we are losing it, and it doesn't take much to lose it quickly. Our incessant spending, the trade deficits that we've been able to get away with by being the world's reserve currency, the ability to export some inflation. But what we have missed as a country that I've talked about publicly since 2005 is the rise of China, and we gave them their military by trading with them, by allowing our U.S. corporations to effectively become Chinese corporations and lobby in Washington here on behalf of China. That has been the wrong move for 20 years, as I predicted in my movie Fixing America, and it now becomes a crisis. But the crisis is extenuated by the fact that our debt, our $24 trillion of borrowing, is too large. And now we got caught between the rock and the hard place. The Fed cannot raise interest rates to quell inflation back to 2%. I'd like to see it at 0. Nor can they repress rates because inflation then will go higher. This was all to come, and now the crisis is here. It's why I'm running for president, to fix it.
Explain what it means to the world, Steve, the United States being the global financial system's anchor.
Yes. What it really means is that we're able, by the fact that in Argentina, they won't transact in Argentina currency. In Venezuela, nobody who builds a building wants to take the Venezuelan currency. They want U.S. dollars. So by being the world's reserve currency, by our laws, by our great country, we're able to create I will call it an artificial demand, but it's a real demand for dollars. That's what helps us export inflation, as the Federal Reserve Chairman Powell has said over the last couple of years. We would have worse inflation if we weren't, we couldn't spend the way we do today if we weren't the world's reserve currency. So because we are the cleanest shirt, to use a quote, in a bad pile of laundry, we still get away with it. And that's why it's always been great for America to be the world's superpower and to use the world's reserve currency. But by disregarding our trade deficits and our budget deficit, we are now on the road to ruin because of it. And people should be worried, and they should turn to the elected officials and say, stop the spending now. Let's get our spending under control so that our children, which is why I'm running, so our children and grandchildren can have a better life. The average American knows this, maybe not in the terms that I know because of my background, but they know we're in trouble. That's why 80% of Americans say that their children won't have the same future that they had, even though unemployment runs at 3.5%. We've never seen statistics like this in our country.
How do we, the power of the lone superpower, how do we deter other nations like Kenya and maybe some in Europe, around the world? How do we deter them from moving away from the U.S. currency?
One, by helping them and having a grand strategy for foreign policy. When we talk simply about China and don't mention Iran, or don't mention Syria, or don't mention Russia, we're doing everybody a great disservice. We've got to let people know in a positive way, not always a negative way, preventing Iran from having a nuclear bomb is a negative way, but in a positive way, that we are the beacon of freedom to the world, and we want Kenya to join us. We want Ukraine to join us. We want countries to join us. And when you join us, you'll get a beneficial relationship with our country. But we can't do that, Armstrong, if our deficits continue to run out of control, and if we don't have a military that we can continue to build up because we're spending too much money in other places. We're down to 296 ships. Reagan wanted 700, got up to 700. We don't have enough to send toward Kenya to make sure they feel comfortable hanging with the United States of America. Look what's happened with Saudi Arabia recently. So all these things work in a circle, either the circle of life where America gets better and stronger and we help people find freedom, or the cycle we're in now, the cycle of death. And it starts with debt, and there's too much debt in America today.
So, Sam Faddis, how would the United States, as a primary source, given its currency, if this were to happen, how would it impact the global economy and trade? Give people a perspective of what that would look like.
Well, and these things can happen quickly. Remember, lots of things that have been really bad, like the start of World War I, happened quickly. They didn't. For example, take a look back in 2008 when rates in Greece and in Spain, they didn't go from 2.75%, 10-year, that 3, we have a problem. They went 2.75%, 12, and there was a disaster. That's how quickly these things can happen, and that's why I'm running for president, because I believe over the next year they're about to happen. And if it happens, you're going to have much more inflation in this country, and you're going to have a real problem around the world with people not being able to settle, and you're going to have lots of bankruptcies, and you're going to have more runs on the banks. Remember, our country just suffered 2 or 3 major runs on real banks. And in 2008, there was the credit crisis. Banks have 3 problems. They have a credit crisis in 2008 when people weren't going to get paid back due to mortgage backs, right? Today, we had an interest rate problem where people took in lots of deposits, put it in 30-year treasuries, and then lost a lot of money and were bankrupt, okay? And then you have also a deposit problem where people flee banks. All that is starting to happen. These are the 3 problems with banks. So our banking system is at great risk, especially if there's a problem with the dollar. These things are happening in front of us, and yet, Armstrong, our elected officials seem to go from one subject to the next, hoping to ignore this problem while it's right in front of our face.
Sam, in the midst of the Trump indictment last week, the U.S. and global media decided to focus on what was going on in New York at the same time while Saudi Arabia and China shocked the world. Talk about that shock wave that is still sending aftershocks around the globe.
Well, I think this is a theme that you and I talk about quite a bit, Armstrong, which is that there are massive things going on in the world that are simply, I won't say memorable, because it's not like we notice them and then we forget about them. We just erase them. So we're watching, as your other guest has noted, sort of the entire unraveling of the economic structure that's been in place now since the Second World War. We're watching China overtake us strategically. The Iran verge of that nuclear device. All we're just kind of pretending like nothing's happening. So we domestically say this is going on, but the rest of the world is not required to engage in that kind of self-delusion, right? So that everything is changing on the world stage, and it's changing with Biden in the White House at a pace that's mind-blowing.
Steve, it does seem as though, as we speak about the dollar, it seems like there are 3 different economies all at once. And depending on who you talk to, they all make sense. But on deeper thought and research, none of them make sense.
Yes, the Federal Reserve needs to be changed dramatically. It has failed our country. It was set up to stop these recessions. They are now getting bigger and occurring more frequently, these real collapses. 2008, we're having one. In 2020, we had one. And so, yes, for really wealthy people, the country is set up very nicely. For the middle class people, their economy is terrible. The person making $150,000 in New York is now middle class and has spent an extra $8,000 to $10,000 on energy alone in the last 2 years. So these people are not getting ahead. Their real wages are falling behind. Working class people and really poor people are not getting ahead. The marginal tax rates on really poor people to get out of poverty sometimes run 80%, because we have a program set up to keep them in poverty. So this all doesn't work anymore. And what we need is a new tax system. I like Herman Cain's 999 plan. I like it to be simple, fair, capture income from everybody, slightly progressive. We need to fix our debt problems, and our economy needs to be back with less regulation so that people can thrive. But we don't have that in our country anymore. And so what we have are people sitting around deciding, well, I can't live in New York City, I think I'll go to Florida. I can't live here, I'll go there, rather than how do I start a new company? And that's why our investment in our country needs to be redoubled for our country to thrive in the long term. Most of our decisions made in Washington are extremely short-term in nature. They have bills that are misnamed as the inflation fighting bill or whatever. They're wrong. And we are at the crisis point right now, as Charles alluded to, and I mean now, like now, Armstrong. It's happening now in front of our faces.
This is Your Voice, Your Future. I'm your moderator, Armstrong Williams. There are many issues that we will cover tonight. Terrorism. We'll talk more about whether the dollar is about to collapse and how it impacts you. We must talk about the Pentagon leak and the president of France, who met with the premier of China this week, in his bizarre, shocking statements that continues to reverberate around the country, that we won't interfere if China decides to take Taiwan. And even some of our guests tonight will debate whether that is already in process, China taking Taiwan. I'm Armstrong Williams, and we'll be back. You know, Sam, there is so much about the leaked Pentagon documents, the concerns, the assessments of U.S. intelligence officials, even discussing Chinese military capabilities and strategic objectives, the strategic points of our operation in Ukraine, the vulnerability of the arsenals that we're providing to Ukraine to fight this war. Even the United States criticism, not only of her adversaries, but even her allies, including Israel. It seems as though there needs to be a geopolitical reset. Take us through, how could this possibly have been out there for a month before our government was ever aware that it was placed online? And it wasn't until the Russians made a mockery of it that the United States realized that there was this devastating leak.
Well, I think you've put your finger on something here, Armstrong, which is, it seems incomprehensible, right? And it is incomprehensible. I mean, there is not a good explanation. It is not okay. There isn't some magic reason why this should happen. It is grotesque incompetence, and I think it's a window into where we are with the intelligence community. You have a lot of really good people. You got technical capabilities that are unparalleled. Well, in many ways, it's not really a serious enterprise anymore because it's not run by people who have learned their trade and cut their teeth abroad, right? So I've been digging into this, trying to figure out how widely distributed this briefing was, because what you're seeing online is apparently hard copy documents that somebody then took photos of and posted online. So as best I can tell, at least 5,000 people in the intelligence community were on distribution for those briefings. Now, in the real world, just as a matter of common sense, you can't take that kind of intelligence, pass it out to 5,000 people, and still think you've got a seat. You don't have to be a super spy to understand that. When 5,000 people access that information, it's going to go everywhere. And yet the people at the top who claim to be the nation's top intelligence officials actually run a system that allows them.
You know, our operative is also joining us now. You know, this is what makes this so dangerous and scary, Mr. Operative, is that obviously there is a lack of faith in what this administration is doing, and also in the U.S. government. There's a collapse in what they consider to be morality. There is no question this leak came within the Pentagon from disgruntled, disenchanted, disgusted individuals who felt that America's secrets needed to be out in the opening. Because if you read the tea leaves online, you know, what they're saying to us is, listen, while you may, through what you read and watch, believe that China and Iran and Russia are our greatest enemy, sometimes you need to take a look within, because our hands are not clean. Mr. Operative?
I agree with you, Armstrong. And in that number of 5,000, a reasonable person has to assume that there are foreign intelligence people that are in the DSIM list that are getting drop copies of this. You can't keep any secrets if you're sending it to 5,000 people. It's just absurd in the extreme to think that that's a document that will remain securely stored in the United States and won't get out. But the morale issues and the crash out of Afghanistan, the reality of losing 2 wars, you're in a situation now where you have a lack of confidence, frustration, anger, and a lot of these young people feel betrayed, especially the wounded guys. And it's compounding on itself, where people don't feel as though that they're part of a system that's worth losing limbs and losing their lives over. Command certainly isn't distinguishing themselves right now.
But how is this, in the short and long term, impacting our relationships with our allies in terms of trust? I mean, you're seeing this information, and the greatest superpower had no idea it exists. It not only exposes us, it also exposes our allies.
It absolutely does. Our allies rely on us to keep secrets that they tell us. And if you're going to read it online in a couple of weeks in the U.S., you mean to tell me at this point we don't have live active monitoring of social media outlets looking for classified material that's getting out overtly? It's hard to believe that that's not occurring. And what is the FBI doing? What is the Defense Intelligence System doing to police themselves? I guarantee if somebody in the agency put something online, it would get detected quickly, and that person would be apprehended and arrested. and then a referral sent to the Justice Department, and the FBI takes over the investigation, and it becomes an espionage investigation. But to have this out there online we probably don't really know when it hit, and to think that we're just now discovering it, it causes a suspension of disbelief to think that this is possible.
You know, Steve, what measures do you think are being taken or should be taken by our government in response to the information revealed in the leaked Pentagon documents, and how might this influence future military and foreign policies decisions concerning not only China, but all our adversaries?
Yes, your guests are right on point. I would just add one thing before that, is that in the private sector, when we were selling a publicly traded firm, Alan Morgan said to me, when 5 people know about something, more than 5 people, everybody would know. So we kept it among 5 for 2 months. 5,000 seems to be beyond the fathom of reasonableness. So it would be prudent for the executive branch today to admit its errors and to revamp who and how many people get access to any of these top secret documents. It's far too many. There's far too many documents, there's far too many people with access, but they don't have the capability, Armstrong, of doing this. They don't have the thought process in this administration to even acknowledge what's happened and change it. A total revamp of the FBI, a total revamp of the CIA is needed. These are not the people to do it. They will never do it. They will never admit errors, and they will keep moving forward, which is what the largest staff in the history of the presidency. But when it gets to our allies, this really undermines America in a way that is not physical, like watching what happened in Afghanistan, which undermined our relationship with allies, which undermined our situation in Ukraine. But it is on the internet way of everybody looking and saying, we can't trust America. And so it takes away our strength at a time when we desperately need it. And this is a real tragedy.
You know, Sam, obviously, this leak came from someone, obviously, who cares deeply about America and our foreign policy. And they may have thought that they were doing a great service to our country. And obviously, they want a global reset. Is there any good that can come from this? Should these documents ever be leaked? Is there ever any justification?
Well, I'm not going to advocate for releasing this classified information, Armstrong. I mean, I think there's a moral, ethical point here, which is important. But let's keep in mind that there are real folks out there in the real world risking their lives to provide this information. And when you start playing fast and loose with the protection of this information, there are people downrange who have put their trust in us. I mean, I have done this, right, for years, as has your other guest, where you're convincing somebody to put their life on the line and the lives of their family for us. And now somebody starts releasing information. Well, somebody dies horribly downrange or rots in a prison cell for the rest of their life as a consequence. So I'm not going to excuse that. But I think everybody's touching on something that's really important here. There is a moral and ethical issue. Our leadership, our institutions the American people don't believe in them anymore. You got guys all over this country, men and women, without limbs, right? Guys who didn't come home alive, who put it all on the line for this country, and they're not seeing institutions they can believe in. I mean, look at this disgusting document the White House put out a week ago, blaming all of Afghanistan on Trump, and the Joint Chiefs and everybody else lined up and apparently rubber stamped that thing. They betrayed the trust of every man and woman that ever served downrange. When they did that, there wasn't a single one of them with the guts to man up and resign and say, I refuse to stand by and endorse that lie. That's the world we live in.
You know, John, I wanted to come back to you, Mr. Operative, I want to come back to China and Saudi Arabia and just how that's going to have ramifications for some time to come.
That situation is one of those things that is not fixable in the Middle East until you have a different administration. I think I don't know whether the Biden administration understands that or is willing to accept that, but you can do things where you insult your allies at a level where it becomes an unrecoverable slight. And what we did with the Saudis, the Biden administration did, and keep in mind, we have been closely allied with the Saudis since World War II. Most people don't go back that far with their historical concern about things, but that's a long stretch to be with them. And the Saudis, for all the accusations hurled at them and the fact that the 9/11 hijackers were Saudis, the Saudis gave us everything after 9/11. They gave us stuff that I can certainly see why at this date they didn't give us, but it would have not have stopped us. We are at fault for not doing something to cause the 9/11 hijackers to question or perhaps make a mistake. We had enough intelligence. We knew something was coming, yet we didn't act on it. But then we insult the Saudis with the calling them a pariah and the fist bump incident and just tell them to turn on more oil like they don't have an economy or an economic model that they live by.
Hold that point.
Absurd.
It is absurd. Hold that point. This is your voice, your future. We'll be back.
It is easier to build up strong children than to try and repair broken men.
The streets are plagued with crime, violence. There's a lot of poverty, and it's all a result of lack of education that's happening in our schools. So it really is a crisis.
We come from very different political perspectives, but we've come to the same conclusion, and that is there is a crisis in the classroom. Children are being deprived of quality of life because they're being deprived of a good education. We must solve this problem. It's incumbent upon all of us to join hands together to get this done.
We can't afford to wait one more day before we address these issues, because every day we lose another child.
Let's stop the politicking. Let's stop the games. Let's really do something to give these kids a real chance at life and being a part of that American dream.
We need accountability for funding. Many of the districts where you're seeing very low test scores, students graduating with very low literacy and math comprehension rates, they are receiving a lot of funding. So where is the money going where our kids aren't being adequately educated?
If you believe every child is deserving of a quality education, please go to educationjusticefoundation.com. So, Steve, how has the anticipation of key U.S. inflation data impacted the value of the dollar in currency markets, and what are the potential implications for the global financial markets?
Well, the markets are looking at last week's CPI number, which on the face of it came in slightly lower than they expected. But again, that's backward-looking data. The dollar is reacting to what current interest rates on who's raising them the most. We've actually risen the most, and the dollar right now is doing relatively well compared to, again, our budget deficits, our trade deficits, things that would normally make the dollar weaker. But the implications going forward is that if inflation is still running at 5%, which it is year over year, and ex-food and energy last month running at an annualized rate above 6%, and the short-term interest rates of the Fed still below 5%, means that the Federal Reserve has been gigantically behind in raising interest rates when they knew that inflation was coming. And what it means, the implications for global financial markets, are bad. In other words, things are slowing down dramatically. It's important to look at leading economic indicators, such as the purchase of durable equipment, which is going down. It's important to look at the yield curve, which is inverted, meaning that a little bit less lending will be happening. It's important to look at regulation in banks, which is steepening due to the failure of, say, SVB Bank, and that means banks will lend less. All these things are dramatically bad with a country that has $24 trillion of borrowed debt and interest rates continuing to be high and looking to go higher. So these are all things that are pushing the country, to the cliff. And we're at the cliff. We're not 5 years away, like I used to say, or 10 years away. We are at the cliff financially in our country, where if we don't do something dramatically, like fix one of our programs, like Social Security, or adopt the Swiss debt brake, which means we can't grow debt faster than our economy grows, then we are going to have a break, a real sudden break in the economy and a sudden break in our financial markets, because they are not set up to go through this system, no matter what regulation's been put on banks. Remember, go back to It's a Wonderful Life. Jimmy, your money's over here. Johnny, your money's over here. We have a very debt-laden bank system because we use fractional banking, right? They only keep 10 to 15% of your assets with them and different securities and so forth. They don't keep all the money and are not a pass-through exercise like they should be to mutual funds where people would actually put money in. So these are all really, really terrible things, and it's all happening at the time where the U.S., as our guests have said accurately, is growing weaker faster, because some of this is how strong does it look? How strong does America look for people to take actions? And when you combine all this together and America looks and acts weak, whether it's with China, whether it's with France, whether it's with Saudi Arabia, then all this stuff comes together and you can have a quick fail. And that's what I think is about to happen in our country. We're going to have some people call it a Minsky moment. There's terms for this where things happen quickly. But all bad things happen quickly, Armstrong.
Sam Faddis, what is trans-terrorism?
Trans-terrorism is the phenomenon we are witnessing today, where we are people are being encouraged to use violence to advance this, I guess, trans agenda. It's based on this idea that somehow or another the transgender community in this country is being subjected to genocide, that there's some ongoing assault on the transgender community. And so increasingly and very explicitly, transgender people are being told, you must use violence. You are justified in using violence. This is self-defense. You have to kill these folks, folks that aren't transgender, because they are coming for you. Now, this is a lie. There is no ongoing genocide against transgender people. There is no mass number of homicides, but the rhetoric's being fed to people, and as a consequence, we are seeing and are going to see more violence.
It's fascinating. I read a piece of yours in A&D magazine on slaves to fashion and human trafficking, that there must be people, no matter what age we find ourselves in, that must do the menial jobs, and they must do things that nobody else in society cares about doing. So that, which represent an overwhelming number of people, not only in this country, but around the world. And I thought it was very insightful. Can you share that story?
Well, the article you're talking about was focused on the fashion industry in the United States, which is largely in Southern California. You see the same kind of phenomenon in chicken processing plants in Alabama and other places, right? The Biden administration wants to the extent they ever want to talk about people coming across the border, they want to make it seem like this is some great humanitarian gesture. They are saving people from some awful fate in whatever country they're coming from. You know, that's not what's happening here. This is pretty close to modern day slave trade, right? What you're doing is deliberately flooding the country with lots of folks who are in an undocumented illegal status, largely, who are then forced to work at the most awful jobs and lack any basic bargaining power, right? All the stuff that unions fought about in the United States 100 years ago, they can't do that because if they make a fuss, they get turned in and they get sent home. So you can do anything you want. You can make them work 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. You can accept, obviously, false documents and employ kids. The workplace can be completely unsafe. And those slaves don't get to complain, right? They have to suck it up. And that's what we're doing, right? While these guys are lying about saving somebody from oppression in their home country, they're turning them into modern day slaves. And in Southern California, it's horrifying. I mean, they pay them on a piecework basis to begin with. There is no hourly wage. They pay them based on the garment. And in some cases, they're making maybe even less than you get paid in Bangladesh for doing that kind of work right here, U.S. soil.
You know, it really sounds like the drudgery of life, Sam.
Well, look, Armstrong, I think, I mean, this is all real. We were talking about China, right, earlier. I think
that's what we accused them of.
Well, it is, but there's kind of an intellectual thread that runs through all this. We had pretty close to open warfare at one point in this country 100 years ago between workers and industrialists, when unions were forcing companies to say, okay, look, I need to go to work and not get maimed. And I need to be able to have a weekend off. And I need to not work more than X number of hours a day. Basic stuff. Now, we thought we won all of those battles and moved on. But what American business in many ways has done is find ways to get around that. So now we import, as I say, pretty close to modern day slaves to do some of this work. And the stuff that can't be done here, where have we sent it? We've sent it to sweatshops abroad where we can just pretend like we don't know what the conditions are under which it's produced. I mean, that it is in some sense a war on American workers and labor. And it all leads to this hollowing out that your other guest has talked about, where if you're really well off in this country, you're living better than at any point in history. And the rest of the country is kind of sinking to the bottom as a consequence.
Steve, does this shock you? Because this is an economy that no one is talking about once these migrants come to this country. And we're talking about all this benevolence and a better way of life, and it couldn't be further from the truth.
Yeah, I'm so glad to hear this discussion. I'm still haunted by my trip across the border into Altal, Mexico, in 2003, where I had to look at the beginning of this trip that Sam is talking about, where young women unprotected were heading to the border to be assaulted, and we couldn't help them because we would be killed, according to Dr. Robin Hoover, who I was with, a Christian pastor. So that was 20 years ago. And so every night, if you're watching this show, there are young women being transported by not their parents, who they've either given them up because they have no money, or they think they're going to a better life, who are ending up in Sam's, what he talks about, sweatshops, or worse, sexually traded young girls, 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds. And this is because we do not take a strong stance against Mexico, against what's happening at the border. We have no common sense place for people a way to people to come and be accounted for. If we have work for people to do in strawberry fields so they can save money and go back, we have nothing except the oppression of really poor people, maybe the fourth group of people, Armstrong, that we haven't talked about, the people, the forgotten people, the people no one cares about. You know, I like to say that these clothes you're looking at, they're made in America. And I know who made my tie up in Vermont, and it wasn't in a sweatshop. But if a president of the United States would take leadership on this issue, and we brought back manufacturing in ways that are acceptable to this country, there's no bigger economic engine than a manufacturing job. In economic terms, it's 4 jobs. And we continue to allow what? The Uyghurs to be in concentration camps, and we ignore that when we buy a Nike sneaker, let's say, right? Or even if it goes to Vietnam. We need a president who says, this is how it's going to happen. We're going to have high-paying manufacturing jobs. People are going to make a certain amount of money to move up the economic ladder in our country, and every human being counts. It doesn't take a Christian to say that, although I am one, but every human being counts the same. And we wouldn't have the situation that Charles is talking about in our country. I mean, I just looked up before I came to the show, there's 54 million people we can count as in a slave trade in the world. If one of them's in America, it's too many. And we as Americans have to shine the light on this. This is what the president can do. Think about what President Kennedy did just with exercise, just with the Presidential Physical Fitness Award that we, as a kid, we were like, wow, this is great. He's shown that exercise was good. We also need that too. But we need to shine the light on this.
Exercise is the last thing our new slaves are thinking about.
I know.
Because their exercise is really slavery.
Slavery. It's terrible.
We'll be back.
As a home buyer, you need a lender who cares about your home ownership dreams. United Security Financial has been helping families secure their dream homes for 30 years. We're a national fair practice lender that provides affordable mortgages and low down payment programs to eligible home buyers. To learn how United Security Financial can help you secure your dream home, call 1-800-373-4186.
You know, the Chinese have poured billions of dollars into lab infrastructure and this engineering policy to become a global superpower. But what is fascinating is that their safety practices have not been able to keep up. And that lab safety is another concern for another pandemic. And China has begun rolling out new rules relating to artificial intelligence that are cause for great concern. These new rules will require that any AI that communicates with people in China must, among other things, reflect the government's socialist values. Believe it or not. Now, we seem to be getting into this dystopian territory, right? While AI chatbots develop in the United States and other countries create their own ideals, we understand and slightly shift them around based on there being inappropriate content parameters. The Chinese government is actively attempting to force companies to create AI that reflects specific political ideology. Maybe the stories that tell tales of well-intentioned AI becoming evil were wrong. Maybe they were evil because they were shaped by evil governments. This is a frightening situation, especially considering the fact that numerous AI experts have sought to pause AI development while the Chinese government has no intention of slowing it down. Mr. Operative?
The whole area of that AI is an unknown risk and an unknown benefit. People claim that they know so much about it, but the truth of it is it's new as the introduction. But you've got to look at it from the global perspective now. It's not just what we think we should be doing here. If you're able to reach into the United States, then you have access to everybody. And you just need to look at the way our system is now, on how much data you actually lose. And this new legislation that they're trying to sneak through on the Hill, which would prevent people from using VPNs and other secure equipment in their emails and personal communications. The government is wanting to restrict your ability to protect yourself simply from fraud and theft of your personal information. If you no longer are allowed to use the security devices that people are using now, widely using, you leave out the fact that the United States government doesn't have the right to listen into your personal stuff. The Fourth Amendment it's pretty much eroded away now. But people aren't upset about it. I don't understand. And AI is like this giant thing sitting there that we don't understand, that half the people want to embrace and other half are cautious about. Well, wait a minute, let's really learn what this is, and how do you detect fraud if you're going to have AI?
Sam, it's baffling to me that France's leader, Emmanuel Macron, is not only pandering to China. These world leaders are so scripted, they're so disciplined. He had to know what the implications would be if he said, let's let China, if they decide to blockade and take back Taiwan, European nations should not be involved, and they should also weigh how much they support the United States agenda.
Yeah, well, with all great respect to the French Republic and the French people, Armstrong, right? We'd never forget that they were there at Yorktown at the inception of the country and all of that. It has been true that the French have gone their own way for a very long time. And, I know we used to say in the agency that the first thing that happens after we impose sanctions on any country is that the French companies will show up the next day to violate the sanctions and make money off of the artificial shortage that we've created. So these are the guys who weren't part of NATO for most of the Cold War and so forth. So I can't, his comments are irresponsible, they're dangerous, completely unproductive, and yet to me not particularly surprising.
I mentioned about China trying to become a science superpower with no regard to facilities, no regard to how things can spill and spread like a virus like the COVID-19 in the Wuhan lab. They seem to have learned absolutely nothing, and no one seems that they can hold them accountable, Sam, or responsible. They can do whatever they want to do, no matter how much it may destroy human life in the process.
Yeah, well, no one is holding them accountable. That's 100% correct. And nobody in this country is making a serious effort to examine how we responded to COVID-19, which is effectively, we failed at every juncture. Everything we did was at best counterproductive. We scrapped our entire existing pandemic response plan and adopted a bunch of Chinese mechanisms like lockdowns. So nobody's examining that. Nobody's doing anything to hold the Chinese accountable. And here's the really horrifying thing, at the risk of sounding like Dr. Doom. The next thing that jumps out of a Chinese lab or is released by the Chinese could be one heck of a lot worse than COVID-19. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It could kill, 1 out of every 3 people. And we're still sitting here planning on running the same game plan that failed catastrophically the last time.
Steve, I got to tell you something. I saw something very frightening come out of the White House over the last 24 hours. Biden is going to remake the U.S. auto industry with the toughest emissions limits ever. Biden, the king.
It is so outrageous. I'm sorry.
Unbelievable.
To see what's happened, by the way, when subsidies go away for electric cars and the dramatic drop in purchase of them in Europe, and then to see what the Biden administration wants to do not by law, but by fiat, by executive order. Along the way, there is, just so people know, there is no way to get enough of the ingredients that you need to make electric cars. Copper, lithium, there's no way to get it. There's never been a time in history where people doubled the production of a commodity in 7 years. So it won't happen. It'll just lead to more shortages. It will lead to more inflation. It will lead to America not being the leader in the free world. And it would just be better to get back to competition. It would have been so much better if people said, well, even though I disagree with this, that there's a problem with climate change, we could have handled it with hybrid cars for a while and moved slowly toward having electric cars that went 500 miles before you filled them up, and it took under 3 minutes. That would be my way of ever getting involved in being for that. So what they're doing is a disaster.
We know it's a disaster, but let me mention this to you, Mr. Financial Guy. Gen Zs and millennials are so broke that they're ruining their parents' retirements. Mm-hmm. What do we do?
Well, I guess they're getting back because we older people have ruined through Social Security, through deficits. We've left nothing for the next generation, for the grandchildren, in fact. And that needs to be reversed. But the real problem with the younger people that I see every day as I'm out campaigning, and I hate to say it this way because I want their votes, but there is a lack of work ethic that has not been passed down to this next generation that is really tough to watch and really tough to talk to employers about how many people don't show up for work these days versus what I went through as a kid, or I'm sure people listening went through. It is really doesn't bode well for America, and we need a president to lead on work ethic, on what we talked about with China. Hey, we had a tobacco settlement where we held in abeyance, right, a lot of money from tobacco companies in '98. Why wouldn't the U.S. government, till they figured out where it came from? I believe it came out of a lab. I believe it was probably leaked. I believe, as Sam said, Tone, that next time it comes, they know how we're going to react, so they know what they could do if they wanted to release something to America, which is really, really bad things to think about.
So, Mr. Operative, Zelensky is outraged over the prisoner of war video beheading, and he wants world leaders to do something. To do what?
That's a great question. He's the idea man, for sure. He wants everybody to do something for him or something that he thinks needs to be done. But he doesn't have anything to add to the argument. Just give me stuff, give me ammo, give me money, and I'll get my country back. And then you should do everything else.
But what about that video? Should we worried about it?
It is an atrocious video, and it brings back memories of the horror of ISIS and other horrors that we let percolate and boil over and spill into numerous countries. I don't know really enough about that video. I'm always skeptical of atrocious stuff that appears online without any real explanation. I mean, the government should be interpreting that and giving facts to the United States population on, well, what is this? What is the truth behind this? So I don't take anything that
finally,
says
Sam, because I know you can do this in a minute. What do we have to look forward to in foreign policy in 30 seconds? Is there anything?
Not until you get rid of this administration. We have done unbelievable catastrophic damage to American national security in about 2 years, right? Whatever it's been, it seems like a decade. Until this administration is out of power, we're going to continue to see disasters, and it could get a lot worse. I mean, you could wake up tomorrow and find the Iranians detonated a nuclear bomb, and the Chinese are now formally blockading Taiwan, and we can move on from there. That doesn't require science fiction.
You know, I appreciate all you patriot-loving Americans, what you do for your country, running for president, serving in the area of intelligence and putting your lives on the line. You care about this country, and we here, WGLA 24/7, we care about this country. And while it may seem harsh sometimes, we do it because we want the best leadership and the best for our nation. I'm Armstrong Williams, and good night.